So hello and welcome. My name is Jason Foster. I'm the director of Parkland Institute. Parkland Institute is a public interest research center based at the University of Alberta, for those of you who don't know us. I'm thrilled today to be able to host this webinar upon the launch of our latest research report, Challenging Parental Rights, a primer for parents, students, educators, and advocates. I'm very excited to have a very timely topic. Before we get underway, I want to acknowledge the Parkland Institute, being housed on the campus of the University of Alberta, is located on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional home and gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Papachase, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe Saulteaux Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others. And as we gather this afternoon to share wisdom, learn from one another, and examine how we can build an overall and equitable and more resilient communities in what is a very challenging and difficult time, I think it is critical that we do so with an eye to the land and its people, and in the spirit of reconciliation and decolonization. I think particularly with the topic of today's webinar, in terms of our children, I think we'd also be very mindful of Indigenous people's understanding about how a whole community is responsible for the raising and caring and educating of students and of children. And so we can be mindful of that as we talk about today as well. So I'll introduce our author and presenter in just a moment, but maybe just a little bit of practical matters. So as this is a webinar format for Zoom, the chat function is disabled. You will be able, if need to, chat with the organizers if there's a technical problem you're having or whatever, but the participants will not be able to chat with one another. However, we will have a question and answer period after the presentation. To do that, you can type your questions into the little Q&A box either at the bottom or the top, depending on what your device looks like. There's a little question mark that says Q&A. You could type your questions into that. I'll be sort of reading through them. I'm trying my best to synthesize them and find a way to make sure everyone gets addressed. So what I encourage you to do is during the presentation, if you think of your question, put it in right away. Don't wait until the end, because A, it increases the chances that we'll see it and be able to get to it, and B, it kind of helps me as the moderator to be able to kind of process as we go. So without further ado, allow me to introduce Heather Ganshorn, the author of the report and our presenter today. She is the research director for Support Our Students Alberta, which is a grassroots organization that advocates for inclusive and equitable public education for all Albertans. And she is also a librarian at the University of Calgary, and equally as importantly, a parent of 2 children who currently are attending public schools in Calgary. So I will hand things over to Heather, and then after her presentation, we'll turn to the Q&A. The floor is yours, Heather.
Thank you so much, Jason. So let's dive in. First of all, just want to mention that this talk is based on the following report, which is available on the Parkland Institute's website. And before I begin, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that I'm speaking today from the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. And Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, districts 5 and 6. A little bit about me. I'm the research director at Support Our Students Alberta. That is a volunteer position. All of us at SOS are volunteers. And I volunteer with SOS because I believe that public education is a public good and a pillar of democracy. And I am concerned about what I've seen around underfunding and privatization in our public education system, and recently also sort of keeping an eye on the growth of this parental rights movement, which we're going to talk about today. So let's dive in. We're going to talk about the growth in this parental rights movement, both across North America and specifically in Alberta. What's the connection to the push to have more privatization in our education system? And then talking a little bit about the upcoming trustee elections and what we might want to watch for. And also those of us who are parents, how can we get involved in our school councils if we're concerned about some of these issues that we're seeing? So the first thing I want to talk about is whose rights are we talking about when we talk about parental rights, and whose rights might we be discounting under some of those frameworks. So I should preface this by saying I'm not a lawyer or a legal expert, but I did cite some writings on this topic in the report by legal experts. And from what I can tell, it seems parental rights are more of an implicit than an explicit thing under the law. So we largely presume that parents are motivated to act in their children's best interests, and the law largely guarantees your right to raise your children in accordance with your beliefs and values, subject to reasonable limits. But the law also recognizes the rights of children. They are citizens with rights, and they are also uniquely vulnerable. So often the law talks more about children's rights and parental responsibilities. Um, and there are laws and conventions that outline children's rights, most notably the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which Canada is a signatory to. And actually, the only country that hasn't signed that convention is the United States, largely because the evangelical lobby has been successful in blocking that. So what does the UN Convention say about children's rights? It has a lot to say about their right to education. It affirms their rights to privacy, their right to seek and impart information and ideas of all kinds, and their right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. And the convention also makes it clear that parents have a role. Of course, as a parent, I feel I have a role to provide guidance in a manner that is consistent with the child's evolving capacities. So basically, that means the older they get, the more you kind of have to start loosening the apron strings. They should be developing autonomy as they move, into their teens. And so a lot of conservative critics take issue with all of this, with the very notion of children's rights in some cases. Um, and this is where I think the parental rights movement is a little bit of a backlash to these developments that we've seen around children's rights in recent decades. Um, so there is a really long history to the parental rights movement, and I go into some of that in the report. In Canada, most often people have invoked parental rights around things like minority language and education. That's kind of been our history, which is quite different from the US. Um, but parental rights as a counterweight to a supposedly progressive education system is kind of a new phenomenon in Canada, and it really owes a lot to the culture war issues that are, um, arguably tearing apart the United States right now. So COVID kind of turbocharged this as a lot of parents were activated around public health restrictions. Even a few years before that, a lot of these groups like Moms for Liberty were sort of stoking fear around critical race theory in schools. The particular topic kind of shifts with the times. And right now, people seem very preoccupied with gender and sexuality, pronoun policies, um, you know, transgender students, and whether teachers are indoctrinating or sometimes even accused of grooming students. So that's kind of where the current discourse is. And so politicians do respond to some of this. In Canada, various conservative provincial governments have introduced legislation or policies that mirror what's been happening in the US. So New Brunswick brought in a so-called pronoun policy that was later reversed when their conservatives lost the election. Manitoba, similarly, their Conservative Party campaigned on this and lost the election. So it's almost like this issue is a bit of a loser in some places. Um, Saskatchewan has introduced a Parents' Bill of Rights that happened in 2023, and we'll talk about Alberta in a minute. But first, I just want to ask again, whose rights are these parental rights advocates advocating for, and whose rights are being overridden? So these laws are not inclusive of all parents. There are parents of, for instance, transgender children who want to affirm their identities, want them to be safe and included in school, want to be able to seek medical care for them, and those rights are being infringed on. Students are at risk of harm if their confidentiality isn't respected in schools. Um, so I've cited a couple of articles from the Tyee that actually do have that parent perspective, and I think it's really good to read that perspective and, honor those parents' perspectives as well. In Alberta, what has been going on in the last few years is that in 2024, Alberta passed some pretty sweeping parental rights bills that went much further than other provinces. This is despite Premier Smith saying initially that she didn't want children struggling with gender identity issues to be turned into a political football. Um, so Alberta's legislation includes the provisions listed here. It's not an exhaustive list. Um, and these policies were generally framed as empowering parents, but they really do undermine children's rights, particularly older teens who have that evolving capacity to make independent choices. So things like infringing on the right to privacy if students are outed to their parents after confiding in a teacher, the right to freedom of thought and conscience, the right to seek information on any topic. I mean, a book ban really does infringe on that. And of course, transgender and non-binary children's rights to healthcare, which it was dealt with in those bills as well. Um, but this goes beyond, a vulnerable minority group and really affects all of our kids. So now we all have to opt in to sex education. Not only sex education, but actually, if you read the wording in that regulation, it is any discussion of gender or sexuality in school. So I don't even know what that means. Are we allowed to talk about X and Y chromosomes in biology class without parental permission? Like, it's not really clear. Um, so this really does affect all of us. And of course, we've had the book ban where school boards were compelled to withdraw 4 titles from school libraries, most of which dealt with LGBTQ plus issues. The minister claimed that concerned parents had alerted him to this, but it soon emerged in an excellent article from the Investigative Journalism Foundation that 2 lobby groups, Action for Canada, which is basically very linked to the convoy movement, and Parents for Choice in Education were actually the ones who went on a bit of a fishing expedition with lists that come from US parental rights groups. And they searched until they found some titles. And then they got a personal meeting with the minister to get these books banned and bring in that ministerial order that went out. So the end result of that, we've seen that reported in the news. Edmonton Public School Board compiled a list of over 200 books. Margaret Atwood is making fun of us. And most importantly, this does infringe on the rights of all children by, removing their classroom libraries. I mean, like on a personal note, I'm so mad about this. If this happens in my kids' schools, just because those classroom libraries haven't been cataloged and we don't know what's in them. So, precautionary principle. Um, so it's not a good situation. Um, in terms of who is pushing parental rights in Alberta, there are a few groups operating in this space. And I think it's important to keep in mind that while they build themselves as parent groups, I would question that a little bit. Certainly, some of them are led by people who don't have children in K to 12 or maybe don't have children at all. And so, what is their sort of angle on this? So I just want to break down a few of these groups. The first group, Parents for Choice in Education, as the name suggests, is primarily concerned with privatizing our education system, bringing in more school choice, but they've also embraced other, I guess we could call them moral issues. And they seem to have a direct line to the provincial government, so they can get a meeting with the education minister when they want to talk about books that they have a problem with. Um, and so all of these groups tend to have actually quite close connections to the UCP. Parents for Choice's executive director, John Hilton O'Brien, is a past president of the Wild Rose Party. And this is not their first win on these book bans. They also have been advocating for opt-in sex education. That is on their website. They have petitions and editorials around that. And that was brought in pretty much word for word when they passed the rules about that last year. So, um, they wield a lot of influence, but they don't necessarily represent all parents. And some of these campaigns are really out of the American playbook of Moms for Liberty. So even the tactics, like showing inflammatory excerpts from illustrated works, out of context of the entire work, suggesting that books for older readers are in elementary school libraries, calling award-winning books pornography. These are all things we've seen from the US parental rights movement. A couple of the other groups that are involved in this, the Alberta Parents Union was founded in 2022. Again, close ties to the current UCP. Their executive director, Jeff Park, is a former staffer for Jeff Callaway, who was the so-called kamikaze candidate who ran for the party leadership against Jason Kenney. I don't see a ton of difference between these two organizations. They are both very pro-privatization. They tend to um, have talking points that sort of run down public education, and they try to engage parents on some of these hot button issues. Um, Take Back Alberta is a little bit of a different group with a broader um, area of concern, I think. They credit themselves with replacing replacing Jason Kenney with Daniel Smith. They effectively have taken over the UCP board. Their people are in a lot of key roles. And their leader, David Parker, has indicated that school boards are a target for their organization in these upcoming elections. So all of these organizations have encouraged their members and allies to run for trustee positions, and some of them have hosted trustee candidate training sessions. And I think it's, important to understand that a lot of these culture war issues that are being pushed right now, there is polarization and conspiracy theories that are feeding some of these things. So I'm not just talking about, oh, these organizations are conservative and they might run conservative candidates. Like, that's fine. We've always had conservative people on school boards. A lot of our current MLAs are former school trustees in both parties. But really, it's that conspiracy theory um, element that is a little bit concerning. So, you know, telling their followers that teachers are indoctrinating or sometimes even grooming children with so-called gender ideology or climate change ideas is another one. So David Parker has described schools as operating under the tyranny of the Rainbow Guard and the Green Guard. And nationally, a lot of the convoy crowd has evolved from fixating on COVID and public health measures to a fixation on these types of culture war issues. So some of them have held protests against gender ideology in schools, and some of those protests have happened right outside schools. So again, intimidating our kids who are just trying to go to school. In 2023, they held something called the 1 Million March for Children in a lot of Canadian cities. If you didn't hear about it, it's probably because it didn't attract 1 million people or even like more than a couple hundred. Um, so a lot of these people, can be dismissed in one sense as a fringe minority, but on the other hand, they're very highly motivated to take action and like to show up physically to things um, outside libraries and drag queen story times and all of this stuff. So they really can't be ignored. And some of the groups pushing for both school choice and for anti-LGBTQ policies in schools, spread stories that students are being given transgender medical procedures without their parents' consent or removed from school and subjected to inappropriate sex education. I mean, if you've ever had to sign a 5-page permission slip for your kid to go to the museum, color me skeptical. There is also a link to privatization in these organizations and with this movement. So Alberta does have probably the most highly privatized system in Canada, where private schools get 70% of the per student funding that public schools get. We have charter schools that are publicly funded and privately operated. And we also subsidize homeschooling to some degree. So in the US, for a long time, the religious right has been quite hostile to public education, and increasingly Canadian groups have taken inspiration for that in having talking points about having funding follow the student. And the culture war issues have been useful to these groups because you can sort of create that market for private education by suggesting to parents that maybe public school are a threat to their values and teaching their children bad things. Um, and they've kind of found these allies among people who maybe aren't socially conservative, maybe aren't religious, but they They are attracted to the idea that education should be a marketplace and parents should be able to choose from a variety of boutique options. So this is sort of an alliance on this one particular issue that we want, more school choice. And so some people are pushing that. And I would just like to highlight that public education has very strong public support and high uptake. So part of this is market creation. You underfund public education while crafting narratives that depict the public system as broken. Or as Noam Chomsky famously said, defund, make sure things don't work, people get angry, you hand it over to private capital. And so this really is part of the reason that even though transgender people are a tiny vulnerable minority, um, some cynical actors are weaponizing them to really stoke these culture wars and sow fear among parents. So, turning to the 2025 trustee elections, parental rights groups have been quite open that they are hoping to recruit candidates to run for trustee positions. They will say that they are just participating in democracy and trying to bring a diversity of views to school boards. Who could argue with that? And, I'm not like I actually agree that we should be aiming for diversity and representation on school boards. But history suggests that when you elect candidates who are opposed to the mission of public education, they're going to bring dysfunction and conflict with them. It's an inherent conflict of interest to be opposed to public education and run for school board. Um, and so they're going to bring in these culture war issues that distract from what I think are really the important issues facing school boards, such as overcrowded classrooms, support for special needs, the explosive growth that we've seen in K to 12 numbers. Um, so it's not that, school board trustees aren't going to have different personal views and values. Boards will need to manage conflicting perspectives, but at the end of the day, you want people who are for public education running for your school board. And I would also note that recently this provincial government removed the ability of school boards to discipline or remove board members that violate their codes of conduct. So the codes of conduct remain in place, but now there's no way to enforce them. And so this is just kind of a recipe for conflict and strife, I think, when boards can't discipline their own members and you've got maybe bad faith people getting elected. So trustee elections are really important, and I think we need to watch for some of the privatization talking points among candidates, watch for coded language that, oh, maybe we don't know what our kids are learning. Schools, in my experience, are very transparent about what kids are learning. Like there are lots of ways to be in touch with what is going on in your child's school. Um, really want to highlight that it's so important to vote, even if you don't have children in the system, because public education affects us all. And many politicians do get their start as a school trustee before running at other levels. So, this is kind of your opportunity to see people in action who may resurface in other roles later on. I would just ask your trustee candidates where they stand on some of these issues we've talked about, find their websites, look at their platforms. For the current trustees who are running for reelection, I think it's totally valid to ask them about their performance on these issues. Have they upheld these policies that are coming down from the province? Have they tried to resist them? Have they spoken out about them? Don't let them shift all the blame to the province. They do have some autonomy and the ability to speak up about measures that are harmful to students. That's kind of the trust in trustee, right? We trust them to act in the interests of the students in their system. If you're not someone with a high level of comfort around grilling a political candidate, you can be more neutral and just ask, what's your vision for public education? What would you prioritize if you're elected? And then get involved in your school council. I really feel like a lot of these parents who have been vulnerable to these narratives that we don't know what are going on in schools, my kids' school council brings in the teachers. They talk about what they're learning in that grade. We hear from the principal every month. So this is a way that you can influence some of the things that go on at your school or raise concerns. Um, and really, they are the legislated voice of parents in the Education Act. It is mandatory for every school to have a school council, and those are the true parent organizations. Um, if it's a bit unclear what's happening with this book ban, but a lot of the books in school libraries come from us. We raise funds for them. And now they're talking about taking books out that maybe parents have raised money for. So I think if your school is withdrawing books from its school library, the Parent Fundraising Society has every right to ask for an accounting of anything purchased in the last couple of years that might now be withdrawn. Um, So to conclude, I would just really like to urge everyone here to reflect on how you can take action on any of these issues through voting, through personal advocacy, letter writing, joining your school council. These are all of our issues. These are all of our kids, and we all have a role to play here. Thank you so much for all your time and attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Heather, for that that informative and provocative presentation. We do have a number of kind of questions lining up already, as maybe not surprising. So again, to remind, excuse me, participants, if you want to ask a question, type it into the Q&A section, and then I'll be able to kind of see it. I noticed a couple people have tried putting them into the chat, but the chat doesn't work quite as well because people don't see that one. So if you could put your questions into the Q&A. So Heather, maybe I'll start with a couple of fairly sort of specific ones. I think you addressed some of these in your talk, but maybe you can maybe expand a bit upon them. The first question is they would like maybe to talk a little bit more about sort of you talked a little bit about, so there's not all of these groups or not all of the people involved in this movement are coming from, you know, Christian evangelical religious perspectives, and that they have a non-religious perspective. And he says some of these people are not even overtly political or conservative. So maybe can you speak a little bit about how those particular parents and groups kind of find themselves involved in this broader project?
Um, well, I think again, like in the cities, school choice is popular among certain people who might, the sort of the history is that private schools and school choice was sort of pushed by the more religious oriented folks who wanted public funds to operate private religious schools. But then with the growth of charter schools, with the growth of other private school options, particularly in cities, I think there is this sort of agreement, they may not agree on all things, but there are more sort of, I think of them as the business conservatives, not so much the social conservatives. I've had lots of people in Calgary tell me that it's great that we have so many schools that compete. Um, and they're out there trying to be better than each other and attract more students. And I guess my rejoinder to that is just that they are competing for a certain type of student. They aren't competing to meet everyone's needs. None of those schools is ever going to be interested in people with, the students that we refer to as complex because they may have behavioral disorders, they may have trauma, they may have mental health issues, they may have complex learning disabilities or some combination of those. And so that's where I think we need to support public education because all students are supported.
Great, thank you. A couple of questions that kind of link in two different ways, so I'll kind of bring them together. One wants to sort of have you talk a little bit more about how they're talking about how globally this movement's often funded and supported by powerful corporate interests. And then there's another participant who's wanting to sort of have you talk a little bit more about how are these Alberta groups that you highlight in the report and in your talk, how are they linked to the US movement? And I think what they're both kind of trying to get at is are there similar sort of basis of support? Is there money flow? Is there a formal connection, or is this more, just sort of ideological, bedfellows?
Yeah, I think it's hard to tell a lot of those things. I mean, certainly in the US, again, we have a lot of the so-called business conservatives funding privatization. People like Bill Gates, the Waltons, who are the Walmart family. Like that's, we don't even have billionaires on that scale in Canada. So they are really putting, something that has happened in the US is a lot of them are putting a lot of money behind voucher campaigns. So the idea that every family gets a voucher that they can personally direct towards whatever kind of schooling they want. And there's not really a lot of oversight or regulation. We don't have that here, although the UCP did vote at one of their annual general meetings to adopt a policy in support of bringing vouchers in. Party policy doesn't always become government policy, so I hope that we never see that in Alberta. Um, in terms of these groups in Alberta, I think it's not clear. Um, we don't really have information on, are they funded? How are they funded? Who's behind it? I assume that they have paid staff because they seem to have a lot of resources in some cases. Um, we know that there are think tanks in Canada, like the Fraser Institute and Cardis, that promote the same sort of line on choice in education and supporting private education. But and then in the case of Take Back Alberta, there's been media coverage of some of their fundraising and running awry of Elections Alberta, and I think I'm not gonna get into the details of that, but people can Google it if they want.
I have an interesting question that comes from a cool bit of a little different sort of angle, which is interesting. When someone's asking if there's any research on the extent into which teachers and other people working in the public education system are sympathetic to the agenda of the parental rights movement.
Um, I don't know if anyone has ever surveyed teachers on that. I think, it would probably depend on, what type of school you choose to work for. Like, I think teachers do select, if teachers have like if they're Catholic, they might choose to teach in the Catholic system. If they're religious, they might choose to teach at a religious private school. So I don't think teachers are a monolith. But I do think teachers get into it for the kids. And more than anyone else, they see on the ground all kids. And that, I think, informs their perspective in a way that none of us as parents really have that view. We're very focused on our own kids. Teachers see every kid who walks through that door, and I think are naturally empathetic towards, really caring for all their students and not, hopefully upholding all of their students' rights.
Great, thank you. A participant who kind of wants to maybe sort of to talk a little bit about kind of the intersections of some of these movements. They're talking about how they're interested that there's these intersections between the parental rights organizations, the push for privatization, and a strong anti-immigrant stance within the right in Alberta. And they use an example of undocumented kids are being kicked out of school because of their immigration status. So they're wondering about the kinds of rhetoric we might expect to see as this sort of comes up, and maybe if you could maybe explain why those various sort of different perspectives kind of come together in this push to sort of shift and change our public school system.
Yeah, I think depending on who you're talking to, I mean, I've definitely noticed a rise in anti-immigrant rhetoric in Canada generally. You have Polyev saying we should 100% shut down the temporary foreign workers program. I know in Edmonton there's been some issues around undocumented kids, and I think the issue there, if I understand it, is that nobody's funding them to be educated, and so the school boards are having to make a choice of whether to take these kids on unfunded. So there's a lot of issues. Um, but then at the same time, sometimes you see these alliances with um, immigrant communities who may be perceived to be more conservative and be sort of allies in this parental rights thing because they may not be comfortable with some of these social issues. So I think it's complicated. Um, and certainly I have seen people saying on social media stuff like Alberta is full. That's quite the 180 from Alberta is calling. So I don't know how this is going to all play out. Yeah, I hadn't really given that a lot of thought.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Um, I'm trying to push off because there's a lot of questions we're getting about kind of what can we do? How do we do something about this? I'm going to try and push those to near the end of the summit webinar because I feel like that's a nice closing place. But maybe I'll touch upon it just briefly with this one question, right? Is one participant's observing that they find that a lot of the talking points developed by these groups are designed to be inflammatory and radicalize people around these issues. And so they're just kind of wondering, has there been any research on effective ways to diffuse this radicalization process? Is there any way that we can kind of combat? What are the best ways for us to kind of combat the way in which they approach these issues in such inflammatory manner?
Yeah, I think, the best way to sort of give people a reality check is to encourage them to be involved in their own kids' school. Like I'm on school councils. It's brutal trying to get people to show up. Um, but I think if you show up, those school councils often meet in the library. You can walk into the library and see what's, available for students. You hear from the teachers about what's going on in different grades. And then I think you have that baseline to check your own reality against what some of these talking points are. Um, and, to be honest, I think parents have anxieties around social change. Some people aren't quite sure where they stand on some of these issues related to transgender students. And I think, these people aren't necessarily bigots, but they are open to maybe some fearful messaging from groups that are very opposed to LGBTQ rights. So there's sort of a space, I think, to talk about why inclusion is important and why, like, even the provision around having to declare your daughter's gender if she's going to participate in school sports. I didn't really talk about that in the presentation, but the forms have apparently gone out. If you want to try out for a sport in your school and you're a girl, your parents are going to have to sign a piece of paper saying you were born a girl. And so talking about why that's harmful, that just doesn't stop with you signing the piece of paper. We know we saw it in the Olympics and we've seen it in the US that when people sort of say, oh, well, that athlete doesn't look very feminine, they're very big, they're very strong, let's see some proof. And so there will be this pressure to go beyond assigning that paper and prove that your girl is a girl. And that is harmful to teenagers who are. Sports has been maybe something that has helped them feel good about their body image, and now they're potentially having their gender questioned.
Right. Thank you very much. Um, Here's an interesting kind of question that kind of jumps from what you were just talking about. So you talked about how this participant comments that you mentioned that parental rights often are in conflict with the rights of children. Yet it seems that children are bereft of any advocacy, especially here in Alberta. And they talk about, the girl, trans athletes. So their question is, how do we empower children in these situations so that their rights are upheld? So I think a bit of a different focus away from the parents and the adults is there a way that we can support children in being able to speak up for themselves?
Yeah, I think that within families, get talk to your kids about politics. Talk about the politics and the political issues that are affecting them. Like I talk to my kids about the book bans. Um, we know transgender people, and so we talk about what the impact might be. And students, I think, should start thinking about politics at a young age, even if they're not old enough to vote. So I know in the last couple of years in Calgary, there have been student-led protests over certain issues. In fact, one of the high schools where some of these anti-trans people showed up to demonstrate right outside the high school, the students walked out in a counter-protest. So I think when students are leading, we should empower them to lead.
Okay, great. Thank you. I've got a couple of participants, again, trying to sort of balance this between trying to answer people's questions and get you into helping them sort of advocate. We had a couple of people though who asked if you could maybe spend a couple more minutes giving more examples or talking more about kind of the coded messages that people should be looking for at the doorstep, and also then maybe what are some of the things that people could say when talking to these candidates to try and you know expose is probably not is an inflammatory word, but sort of bring out what their real positions might be. I know certainly my experience at the doorstep with school board candidates is often they're very good at talking the platitudes, right? In the high level buzzwords, but actually what kind of things could you do to actually get them to talk about these issues more specifically?
Yeah, I think just, getting specific um, about some of these ministerial orders and bills that have come down, like um, certainly for incumbents, how have you handled this when it came up? For new candidates, what are your thoughts on safe schools for all students and um, inclusion for LGBTQ students, and how do we balance that against maybe what we're mandated to do by the government? Um, and the book bans, I mean, people can sort of pick and choose and ask specifically. Um, but also looking for, how would you support public education? Like, why are you running for trustee? What is your vision for public education? Sometimes those questions are really illuminating. Um, and I think if it, um, looking into what motivates people, I think is very illuminating as to what kind of a board member they're going to be.
Great, thank you. I should mention, because I've noticed that we are seeing a few questions about people wondering about whether the recording this webinar will be posted. It will. It'll be on the Parkland's YouTube channel. It sometimes takes a few days to get there, so it won't be up there this afternoon, but we'll get it up there as quickly as we can, just to answer those questions for people. Um, Bit more of a technical question I'll throw at you for the moment to kind of shift gears a bit. This partner was sort of appreciating your reference in your discussion about the UN Convention, and they're wondering where, if at all, children's rights are defined in federal and provincial legislation, if they are.
Yeah, I think that varies a little bit by province. I mean, we don't have like a sweeping um, law about children's rights federally. Uh, I think the default assumption is probably that children are citizens. They are a vulnerable class of people. If you look at some of the writing around where do these conflicts tend to, head to court, which is sort of illustrative of how adversarial they can sometimes be. It is often parents wanting to impose rights, not just not in education necessarily, but like there have been corporal punishment cases that go to court. There have been like issues. I mean, we all probably remember the case of the father and mother who didn't seek medical care for their child who had meningitis, and he ultimately died, and that went through several rounds of court cases. So those are the kinds of things where, you know, children very clearly have the right to medical care. They have the right to be safe. But how that's interpreted by some people and what parents think they have the right to decide for their kids sometimes ends up going to court.
Right, good, thank you. Um, About, we have, again, I say, a bunch of questions about kind of what can people do, and we'll kind of get to that in a minute. But this one's kind of fairly specific, and so I think it might be worth kind of answering on its own. And this person is sort of saying, as a chair of a school council, what can we do to help aside from sharing info with our parent community at large? Is there some more organized way they could either work with SOS or other organizations to try and push this out to the parents that the council serves and represents?
Yeah, so school councils can always communicate with their parent membership. I believe there is some digital privacy legislation that means that you don't have access to your school's mailing list of parents. Sometimes I know with our school councils, we've worked with principals to put things in the weekly school newsletter, but I think that gets a little dicey when some of these issues are maybe a bit more political. And so you can ask parents to opt in to school council mailouts at the beginning of the year. And then that gives you, really the opportunity to email those parents directly. All parents in a school are by default members of school council. Um, the organization for school councils is the Alberta School Councils Association. And so if I believe, I know in Calgary, you do have to join that, and the CBE will provide the funds for your membership fee, but you have to indicate that you're joining ASCA. Um, they are the forum that is supposed to bring concerns on behalf of school councils to the provincial government. They have an annual meeting where they discuss policy resolutions. Um, so I think that is more the appropriate forum for school councils to maybe work together. Coming to the community of school councils meetings that the school boards have and meeting other school council chairs, I think is also really important, for us all to get to know each other and realize, oh, hey, my school's facing this same issue that your school's facing.
Great, thank you. It's a bit of a speculative question, so feel free to do what you wish with it. But this is just wondering if you have any worries about the possibility that the provincial government could introduce legislation that would remove elected school boards altogether.
Um, yeah, that's a good question. That has happened in Canada. So I think Nova Scotia eliminated their school boards and Manitoba attempted to do so, but there was a lot of public pushback, so they had to walk that back. Um, I think when we look at this government getting rid of the ability of boards to govern, to discipline their members, I mean, it seems like, that could be laying the groundwork for sort of not allowing them to manage dysfunction within their board or conflict or um, actors who violate their code of conduct, and then the government can say, oh, well, the board is dysfunctional. That has happened in Alberta before too, where the entire board gets fired because of a perception that it's dysfunctional. So I think, this is something that is a bit of a trend, and um, yeah, it's something that I've thought about that I hope doesn't come to happen, because to me, it's really important that school boards are locally governed, that we have a local voice in our school board, and it is not coming from the top, from someone who maybe never visits your community and is making policies.
Thank you. This is an interesting sort of nuanced question, and it's kind of focused around how do we build our capacity to engage in dialogue. And what this participant is saying is the system is not perfect, the school system's not perfect. People have questions about things happening in the system that often we shut down their perspectives because it may bring into question the validity of public schools. So how can we have more conversations where we invite people in to share their concerns, not necessarily to agree with them, but to create space for dialogue? So if they're saying if our goal is to have people listen to our perspective, then we need to create space to listen to theirs. So what are your thoughts on that is what they're asking in terms of how do we create dialogue without creating a platform for the more extreme views, but still being able to hear people's legitimate concerns about the state of the system?
Yeah, I think that's a really hard question to answer, because I think we're in a polarized society. People have become accustomed to fighting on social media. Um, Again, I kind of come back to your local school first. There's a diversity of people and perspectives in every local school, and I think when you know someone on a personal level, it's easier to empathize with them, to realize that we have common ground on this thing. Maybe we disagree on this other thing. Sometimes I think maybe those need to be facilitated conversations, where they're happening at a higher level, like maybe the school board level. Um, Not everyone is going to agree on everything. And I think some people have strongly held beliefs about some of these issues that, um, you know, we have to respect people's rights to have their personal beliefs. But where the line comes is when you try and control how those personal beliefs are acted out for other people's kids. That's my personal line.
Okay, great. I'm going to shift us momentarily to there's a handful of questions around what do we do. We'll get to them in a second. I'll give you one technical question first, and then we'll maybe do that shift. This person's asking, you mentioned, you briefly talked about the voucher system in the US, and indicated that, in your opinion, it was not a good idea. This person's wondering if you have examples of the pitfalls of this system, where it's been implemented in the US, and why you have this position where you feel like it's not in the interests of students and our communities?
Yeah, so I think in the US, there's been a lot of abuses of vouchers. There have been research around vouchers that have found that they lead to worse educational outcomes. Like you sort of have this illusion that you're in charge and you're choosing, but it has sort of funneled money to a lot of pretty suspect private schools operating out of strip malls. There have been cases where the kids show up for school and the school is just shut down. It's just not there partway through the year. Um, Vouchers have in some states been given to parents with really no strings about how they can be spent. So you can use them to order Lego on Amazon if you decide that that's educational for your child. Um, and these are, all of our dollars, our public taxpayer dollars. Um, I'm a bit of a fiscal conservative in that I think public dollars should be well spent and accounted for. Um, and so if you're sort of giving everybody the opportunity to spend on something that maybe isn't delivering good value, I don't, people can spend their own money on whatever they want, but why are we putting public dollars towards some of this?
Right, thank you. So, as we get closer to the end, I'm seeing there's just kind of a bucket of just two buckets of questions about what do we do. There's a bunch of number who's focusing specifically. I'll start with the specific, and then we'll get a little more broad around what can we do to help push back against the school book bans. There's been a handful of people who want to talk about what action can they take to try and help beat this damaging policy back.
Um, well, I think we've been doing okay actually. We've apparently um got a pause put on this. I'm not quite sure for how long. Um, I really think it would help if trustees spoke openly about this, and I'm quite disappointed that there hasn't been any trustees really willing to take an anti-censorship line. That's my personal opinion. Um, in terms of parents, I think that list of 200 books from Edmonton Public. Get your kids to write their trustees and to the minister about these, about what was their favorite book from that list. Like I know that one of them was it The Fault in Our Stars. That's a hugely popular YA book. It's on that list. So this is again your opportunity to get your kids engaged in a political issue that affects them directly. If ask questions at your school. School councils have a right to know if books are being pulled from their school libraries. Like this should be brought up at the first meeting of school council in September. What is going on in this school? What have you been told by the board? What are we being required to do around this policy?
Great, thank you. So then the broader question is there's a handful of questions around um, the coming trustee election and recognizing that this is quite pertinent for that and asking, I guess they seem to come into two sort of types. One is how can people go about learning who the parental rights candidates are so that they can kind of know who to be concerned about. But then also there's just a series of questions around what can they do to help make sure that this trustee, that we elect trustees that support public education? And I realize that's a big, broad question, but I figure it's probably a nice way to let you kind of expound at the end and close it all off. So maybe give us your sense of in the coming couple of months as we get into the municipal elections and school board elections, what can people do? How can they get involved? How can they educate themselves so that we can kind of put a break on some of the advances that TVA and others are trying to try and achieve?
Yeah, so I know in Calgary where I live, there is a municipal elections website that lists all the candidates for both city council and school boards with their websites, their contact info. So you can look up your ward, who's running in your ward, um, and check out their websites, contact them. No, there isn't like a registry of, who these organizations have put forward. And I think they've gotten a little bit savvy in how they communicate, because last time there was a quasi slate of take back the CBE people and none of them got elected. So it really is to me quite like subtle about, you know, I've just seen a couple websites where it's like, we want to make sure parents know what their kids are learning about in school. And I'm thinking like, I get a newsletter from the school every week. I get a newsletter from my kid's teacher every week. I'm not unaware. So that to me is just something that not necessarily a red flag, but something I would ask them about. Where do you think that parents aren't getting information, or what information do you think parents need to have? Um, and let's be real about what the trustee's job is. It is a governance role. They are accountable to the Minister of Education. They don't have the power to go rogue, overturn everything, and impose their own thing. So I think understanding that role and what they are able to do and what they're not able to do within that role, and just that overall commitment to our kids, to all of our kids, are things that I would look for on the positive side.
Great. Thank you so much, Heather. So thank you for this. Thank you for the answer to the questions and to your presentation, and of course for the report. So on behalf of Parkland, I want to thank you for all your efforts to make this happen. And I want to thank all of you for attending today. Hopefully you've learned some things. Hopefully we've got some better awareness about this issue and how it might impact the elections coming forward. And so for those of you who don't know the Parkland Institute, we receive no government funding. We receive no substantial support from the university. We basically, what we raise is what we can work with. So if you like this report, if you like the work that we're doing, consider supporting Parkland Institute so that we can do more work like this. And you can, and I think it'll be put in the chat link. You can find a link to Heather's report on our website. If you want to read more deeply into the presentation that she gave today. So once again, let me thank you for your time and your interests and your questions. And again, thank you to Heather for your insights around this important topic. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.